Dr. Hurtak, if you had to describe your work and yourself, what would you say?
I was trained as a social scientist, an anthropologist. I also think of myself as a futurist and a remote sensing specialist. That is to say, I use radar technology and laser technology to look at archaeological areas that are very inaccessible. Yes. And so, in a very general sense, I'm a specialist in many areas, a generalist of many subjects.
When did you first start being interested in social science?
As a young man, I was interested in reading everything and anything from the books of antiquity in the ancient Near East to those of the Far East. And I was always taken back by the large gargantuan temples of Egypt in the statuary. I was aware that in order to solve the problems as to why Egypt was so important, I would have to learn the disciplines and the languages. And so I spent a fair amount of time at several universities to find out what type of intellectual tools I would need really to open up the back door to the antiquity of the Near East, and for that matter, the back door to our Bible, which has quite a bit of Egyptology if you look at the book of Genesis.
Dr. James Hurtak has lectured worldwide to scientific and spiritual groups, working at problem solving and bringing a message of hope. It is his fundamental belief that pyramidal culture and philosophies through the world are linked, and that these stellar observatories signal our alignment, ultimately, to a higher being. In 1973, Dr. Hurtak wrote The Keys of Enoch, which speaks of great change biologically, geophysically, and astrophysically. Dr. Hurtak, how did you come by the knowledge to write a book of such huge importance?
This knowledge was a result of my higher consciousness experience. This morphogenic door that was opened suddenly and dramatically, and a quantum shift took place for me where I was shown scenario or mental pictures of where we came from, why we were here, and where we're going. That we as a human race must re-examine where we are, and in a dramatic sense, these 64 keys or chapters of knowledge open the back door and the front door to history.
Dr. Hurtak, you talk about forgotten knowledge and future knowledge. What exactly do you mean by that?
Knowledge that is not within the classical area of information, that goes back, say, before the Egyptian period, or before the dynastic Japanese period, or before the period of the indigenous people in North America. Areas of information that suggest at one time there was a parent culture, or there was a culture that connected the diverse peoples and languages. And in essence, the roots of civilization could be found for all peoples if such a parent culture were found and identified.
What do you think would be the value of these discoveries?
Well, given the complexity of post-World War II Europe and Asia, with the developing nations seeing themselves as victims of the colonial periods, seeing the great diversity of religions and the rivalry between various factions, finding of authentic cultures of the historic perspective would tend to unite people and provide a dialogue where the pluralism of the human society could be emphasized.
In the early 70s, Dr. Hurtak and colleagues, using laser technology, found some interesting correlations at Giza, suggesting that ancients used the pyramids as some sort of observatory. But more significantly, that the star shafts align with the Orion complex, pointing to the fact that these structures are much older than the classics believe. Dr. Hurtak, there was a lot of resistance from the Egyptian authorities. Why do you think that was?
There was a bit of, how should I say, friendly anticipation of what could be found. At the same time, there was certain uncertainty as to the use of new technology. And so we had to show that we were not be involved with anything that would violate really the sanctuary and the cultural history of that part of the world. Nevertheless, there was a feeling amongst many of my colleagues that going back more than 6,000 years in terms of showing that the Bible, the Quran, all of the sacred documents are but secondary documents to a much earlier history, which was resynthesized in the written traditions of these great works, would be unsettling to many of the theological perspectives.
Well, by doing this, I suppose you would upset the accepted history and certainly also the sort of tourist culture.
Well, I think this is the challenge of life, that we are not a host to linear reality, that we have the ingenuity to break out of the shell of history, and that history is really an arbitrary enterprise, whereby scholars agree that they're going to define history. Egyptology, for example, is considered Romantic history by many specialists. Yes. And there are things that are thrown out with the bathwater that maybe do not fit into a particular chronology of what king came first or what emperor came last. And what we have as futurists is the unique opportunity to look at the entirety of global culture and to recognize the Great Pyramid in Egypt is possibly but one point of departure for reconciling ourselves with pyramidal objects all throughout the planet.
Dr. Hurtak, can you explain exactly what the star shafts are?
The star shafts are those openings that are on either side of the Great Pyramid of Giza that serve as symbolic openings to the stars. Some believe they are air shafts that would permit various currents to come into the inner chambers of the Great Pyramid. Still others believe, from what we would call the esoteric traditions of knowledge, that the star shafts would guide the soul of the pharaoh from the domains of the earth through the lower heavens to the higher star fields of the imperishable gods, generally associated with the constellation Orion. And so our finding that Delta, Zeta, and Epsilon, the three major stars, were precisely aligned with the south star shaft of the Great Pyramid. This was something that we were onto 20 years before popular books appeared with the Orion Mystery and other such titles. But the realization that there was a mathematical, astronomical connection with the inner chambers and the star shafts, and that these inner chambers were so mathematically and precisely orientated for acoustical and sound measurements, and yes. Could I say higher consciousness experience, creative experience, led me to believe that they were put together by architects, masons, scientists who had tremendous acumen, tremendous knowledge at a much earlier period of time.
Can you explain the significance of the alignment of the star shafts with the belt of Orion?
In my opinion, the significance would show we as a planetary humanity are on the belt of Orion in terms of where our little sun system is, in terms of the galactic pinwheel. And the alignment with the Orion belt would be a keen signal as to where the ancients felt we originated as a experimental culture. It would also signal in terms of religious and anthropological symbolism that the ancients believed that there was an experiment of life that came from the gods or from the higher, quote-unquote, programmers of starborn intelligence. Mm. In the context of the Greek philosophers who believed that life was floating throughout the universe as a type of what they would call free-floating sperm, the technical word is logospermatokoi, that the very seeds of intelligence came in from the direction of Orion, and somehow the construction of the Great Pyramid and the alignment of the star shaft, both at belt of Orion, would be a way of saying that this is the mothering culture. We can ultimately reconnect somehow in a way of scientific evolution with this culture, and we have found in our research, even before Egypt, I'm speaking now of the Academy for Future Science, that there were pyramidal objects on the surface of Mars that I had an opportunity to interpret from the Mariner 9 film footage in the early 70s and the Viking 1 and Viking 2 film footage from 1976. And so the whole specter, the evolution, doesn't stop with planet Earth, but continues into space.
What is the significance or the link between these pyramids?
If you look very carefully at the original film footage of both the Mariner as well as the Viking probes of Mars, you will see that the pyramidal constructs, whether you look at them as natural or artificial, are built precisely with the alpha angle, that is to say, architecturally speaking, with the four sides, with the geometric proportions that we find with the Great Pyramid of Giza. In fact, the Arabic word for the area of the Great Pyramid of Giza is Al-Kahira, which means the majestic one, or one of Mars, as is sometimes referred to. So there's a very strong connection the Arabic philosophers and the great Islamic scholars thought of when they thought of Mars and Giza. There is also an interesting correlation that we found in the examination with a colleague from Stanford Research Institute in California as we re-examined and reprocessed the Viking film. Shows an interesting pyramid with two parallel walls, the sun angles of which look like the funerary temple at Dendra, Egypt. And my colleague Lambert Dolphin, who's one of the leading Egyptologists and remote sensing specialists, thought that was quite an interesting correlation going on between Mars and Egypt, that we would find details that were then given to a private computer conference of engineers, planetary scientists, historians, and the majority that went into this computer conference who were skeptic came out of it after looking and reprocessing all the film as accepting the possibility that Mars may have had some form of evolution millions of years ago when it had an atmosphere. Shocking as this may seem, it may prove to be one of the great challenges of taking a closer look at Mars and going back and standing at the foot of the great pyramids in Sidonia and the Elysium Quad Triangle and saying, yes, these are real. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, then the whole astronomy of our planetary science will be changed immediately.
You've done a lot of work in Egypt. What is the link between Egypt and the southern Africa?
Years ago, when I taught African studies, two of my students studied with Mary and the late Louis B. Leakey in East Africa, and we have this marvelous picture of human evolution some 4.2 million years ago. And this led to my interest in how Egypt influenced East Africa at a later period of time, suggesting that we really have two evolutionary undercurrents. We have the Darwinistic evolutionary perspective, and we have one that suggests that there might be a higher evolutionary impact somewhere along the line. Cultures from a parent civilization someplace else on our planet, or even we would call one from an astrobiological source, an off-planetary culture may have made an impact upon our civilization. My work in East Africa led to correspondence with Credo Mutwa. In 1987, I made a documentary called The Voice of Africa, where we looked clearly at the Zulu tradition and what could be called the interesting folklore and stories that the Zulus themselves have a very unique star-born history, suggesting that their beautiful women were once brought to this planet through vehicles called the Maracaiba. And this Zulu term is very much like the Hebrew word in its etymology. The Hebrew word Merkaba deals with a spiritual spacecraft or an airborne ship that comes from the higher worlds of creation. The fact that two different cultures have the same terminology, so to speak, suggests that it's very possible that somewhere along the line there was an interplay between the human evolution and parallel evolution. I'm suggesting that this is a shocking topic and most scientists will consider it pure nonsense. But if we are to do justice to the authentic African tradition and look at the oral tradition, the unwritten dialogue that has been handed down, there is clearly a point of departure that suggests that we are an experimental human race and that there have been other factors that have come into the story of creation after things were set in motion.
Dr. Hurtak, could you explain the connection between Africa and Asia?
Our work has been to look at the overlap between the Egyptian and the African tradition coming down from East Africa, as well as to look at the impact of the Oriental cultures coming from the East that we also find in East Africa and we find amongst the Hottentots, suggesting an Afro-Asian diaspora of a cultural connection at a much earlier period of time than most European anthropologists and historians would like to accept. As shocking as this may seem, it appears that at a much earlier period of time there was commerce, scientific exchange on a very high level between the peoples of China, the Far East, and of Africa, and perhaps the navy of China was able to make its way into the Near East. Certainly we know later the Phoenician period of the Mediterranean, Egypt was able to bring artifacts to the Pacific. This is one area of contact that I find very intriguing. Another is the spiritual traditions, suggesting that through the casting of stones in oracle bones, there was a higher connection of using oral history to divinate and to look into the future. And then, of course, we have the DNA work that's presently being done at Emory University, and suggestion that rather than have Homo erectus suddenly appear in Australia and in the Far East, in China with the, shall we say, the gigantic Gigananthropus, and in Africa, there is more of a connecting link in the DNA pattern. And so on the basis of a very rich blueprint, Afro-Asian studies, I believe, will open the door to a fuller understanding of our cultural history as a planetary humanity. Certainly everything is up for grabs with the new findings that anthropologists have made with the concept of Lucy as being the parent's mother form with her 7 daughters migrating out of Africa to the Far East and to other parts of the Near East and even Europe. So we have this wonderful idea of Africa as the hook of civilization connecting with the diverse populations of the world. And we have this amazing culture history that doesn't fit into classical Darwinistic theory that suggests that there may be still another connecting link. And we have found this connecting link in more recent times with our investigations in Japan, with the islands of South Japan, more specifically the island area of Yonaguni and Okinawa.
Returning once again to the Keys of Enoch, Dr. Hurtak explains that via mathematical interpretations, in 1973, he had already plotted the position of an ancient civilization at Yonaguni, which could indeed be Mu.
Right, this is the map in 1973 that I worked out mathematically. If we can look here through my glass, I point to longitude 121 degrees plus that intersects just along Taiwan and off the coast near Yonaguni, where this ancient civilization would be found.
But what led you to look for these ancient parent cultures there, geographically?
In working with the ancient manuscripts of the Bible, the Torah, I worked on certain mathematical interpretations of the spread of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And mathematically, if I can use the term, through certain higher consciousness experiences and insights, saw the human race as being broken down into 12 major divisions, 10 of which were in areas that hadn't been sufficiently explored in the Far East and in the West They're in areas of the islands of the Pacific in South America. Underwater findings by the Japanese explorers in the 1990s brought a call to my office saying that we know that you've figured out some of these areas. Would you be kind enough to go with us on one of our expeditions? And so I was personally invited to Yonaguni, and the other scholars and anthropologists who did the diving validated the fact that there were these underwater pyramidal temples, specifically in the area that was on the map that was in the Keys of Enoch. Scientists from the Scripps Institute in La Jolla, California, which is the premier institute for oceanography and underwater exploration, has essentially accepted the fact that if there was land movements off the coast of Asia, they would be primarily in this particular area, and that this area would be ripe for apparent culture that spread across the Pacific and possibly may have been behind the exploration of South America and the birth of civilization in the Americas themselves.
Dr. Hurtak, so all these findings all over the world are actually linked?
They're not linked as a roadmap, but they're linked in terms of artifacts that we're now finding in various parts of Peru and Ecuador, suggesting that a type of Proto-Japanese culture made its way to the shores of Peru. And we are finding evidences, footprints in South America suggesting civilization is much older at Monteverde. In Chile, Tom Dillahay and his associates have validated in a very unique way that there was human civilization going back, if I may use this word loosely, civilization, human society going back some 25 to 30,000 years ago, that had small toys for children, that had its own tools, that may have suggested a evolutionary movement of mankind from the southernmost part of South America up into Central America, into North America, rather than the other way around, civilization coming from North America down into South America. So we have all of these breakthroughs that are now taking place at the beginning of the 21st century, which led the editors of Newsweek magazine to have this spectacular cover entitled, "Who Were the First Americans? Who were the real Americans? Were they the Asians? Were the Asians here thousands of years before Columbus? And how could they get here? Did they have an ingenuity of navigation? Were they part of apparent culture that we find at Yonaguni?" But think of the fact that there are now massive pyramids under the ocean suggesting evolutionary change at a much earlier period of time. And this finding would suggest that if this is validated by other scientific teams, means we will have to rewrite the textbooks of history.
Absolutely. Dr. Hurtak, one assumes that many of these civilizations did in fact self-destruct. What do you think were the causes of the self-destruction?
In our explorations in Central America, in Guatemala and Belize, a small country next to Mexico and Guatemala, we found amazing networks of canals suggesting that upwards of 70,000 people within the interior of the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula and below could be supported by fresh water brought in, and somehow the imbalance of ecology and the environment led to the destruction of this very, very unique proto-culture. We find in Yucatan similarities with what we find in the Far East, suggesting that possible sunspot activity may have influenced the hydraulic cultures, may have caused the destruction of peoples in Central Asia, and certainly in North Peru. There was a disruption of the environment. In Yonaguni, there's a little different situation, and one cannot say with any certainty as to whether they went through what we would call a self-destruct mechanism, or whether it was due to other factors of nature, such as the rising of the ocean, some 300 feet, 100 meters plus, due to the end of the last ice age some 10,000, 12,000 years ago, when the runoff just raised the ocean gradually, or there was some type of cataclysmic mechanism that caused the island societies of the South Pacific, what some would call the so-called Lemurian myth, to disappear suddenly.
So many breakthroughs are being made right now at the beginning of the 21st century. Why do you think that is?
I think the question is one that begs the reality that knowledge is duplicating itself every 18 months due to the computer revolution, the information revolution, the revolution going on in nanotechnology, that which is beyond the visible range of the human eye down to a level of 4 or 5 microns. Mm-hmm. The whole synthesis of breakthroughs in global education, global science in terms of sharing through satellite technology, through beaming up and beaming down instructions to every classroom on the planet, suggests that we are a university without walls that are learning things at an incredible rate. And this has allowed for breakthroughs between specialists who can look over their shoulder and say, yes, I see where this piece of mathematics falls in place. I see where this piece of Egyptology matches this finding in Yonaguni, Japan. I find where this shamanistic plaything of Africa and the Zulus falls in with the culture history of the peoples of northern Amazon region, and so on and so forth. We're seeing bits and pieces of forgotten history that have been overlooked, that are in the tremendous richness of the third world peoples, the indigenous peoples, suddenly come alive. I think it is also due to the fact that the intelligence of the human race, if I can use the imagery of the bell curve, is on the rise. We are exponentially reaching a point where it is much easier to see ourselves as coming through with breakthroughs in medicine and astronomy, breakthroughs in nuclear science, the whole new spectrum of physics and medicine, is showing that we're basically one human being on the planet, that we can exchange the biological parts of the human anatomy. We can restructure the way the human languages can come into the language of cybernetics. And through satellite education, we can build a universal language process. And then in terms of spiritual attunement, we are seeing through the lost books of the Bible, some of the Coptic Nag Hammadi texts in Egypt that I've worked with, and some of the Chinese oracle bones from Central Asia, we're seeing that the human race goes through ups and downs, many ebbs and flows, many cycles, and that we are just one of many cycles. But we have now a unique opportunity at the 21st century to overcome our preoccupation with death and destruction and put together a great synthesis of where we as human beings can go as members of the same family, members of the same human race, with the endowments possibly connecting with our evolutionary counterparts, what I will call the cosmic cultures of outer space, and possibly, in a deep sense of humility, show respect for the great forefathers and foremothers of Africa and Egypt, the Near Eastern cultures of our Judeo-Christian and Islamic heritage, as well as those of the cultures of the East, that there were indeed superminds that were here upon the planet walking as we are walking and talking tens of thousands of years ago, that there are too many scientific and geological anomalies, too many archaeological anomalies to say it's all there in a unique package, that history begins 6,000 years ago. To the contrary, we're looking at 36,000 years ago. We're looking at the oracle bones and the traditions of northern India, the Taklamakan Basin of Central Asia, and China, pushing back history at a much earlier period of time.
Dr. Hurtak, you've mentioned acoustical applications at some of these ancient sites. Can you explain further?
A tremendous breakthrough has occurred now for cultural anthropologists and others, such as myself, who are looking at the specter of these ancient temples throughout the world, the pyramids of Mexico and Egypt, in China, all sharing similar musical, acoustical applications. For example, inside the Great Pyramids, we were the first to bring in sophisticated computers and do sound tests, and found that the vibratory range was from F to F sharp, which is a fundamental vibration for the vibration of Mother Earth. This is known to shamans, but to find it, to document it with precise feedback measurements with former NASA engineers shows that the musicologists and mathematicians of Egypt used the Great Pyramid as a music box, a sound box, to entrain human consciousness into higher states of creativity. They find that same F-sharp resonance within the pyramids of Yucatan, and find it also within the interior of pyramids in Western China, Xinjiang or Xi'an, the old capital of China, suggests there's a correlation between mathematics, music, and architecture that we have to explore, that go literally back thousands of years. So everything is up for grabs. And what I'm saying to you and our world audience is we must not have blinders to use Western civilization as the measuring stick, or romantic Egyptology, or the African anthropology prior to the apartheid period as the way of looking at the missing pieces. The voice of Africa is going to speak on several fronts. The voice of Asia, particularly of Yonaguni, in my opinion, is going to speak on several fronts. And we're going to find in this specter of large temple structures, some of which are more than 100 meters long, that have turtle designs for temple reliefs buried beneath the Pacific Ocean, suggesting subaerial reality that is, at one time it was once above water, showing a symbol that is a universal archetype to all of the indigenous people, namely the turtle supports Mother Earth. The turtle is the foundation of civilization. To find it beneath the ocean at 4 different locations in the Pacific, to find it in the deserts of Mexico, in the zone of silence, to find it in North America, suggests a history and anthropology that is forgotten. And we believe that this is a very vital part of how we as a human race must come together for dialogue in the 21st century.
Dr. Hurtak, there's been a lot of talk about lost civilizations, and then also at the same time there's a lot of talk about us going towards the end of our own civilization. What are your thoughts on this?
We are certainly going into a technological drift toward self-destruction. It could be said that the militarization of outer space, the specter of military satellites, the whole uncomfortable position that society could collapse from biospheric poisons, the death of the rainforests. We know from satellite technology that we are going into a very critical period of time, and possible sunspot activity in the next few years may have also some very dangerous consequences on our airborne technology. I'm a futurist and I'm a positivist in the sense that I believe that these critical mass situations can be used as opportunities and challenges for crossing borders and recognizing that the gifts of sight and spiritual attunement are very tremendous, and that in the context of findings in outer space, what we found on the surface of Mars, and what I wrote in my book, The Keys of Enoch in 1973, would be found. The validations of large artifacts suggesting that evolution at one time was there on our sister planet all point to something in the way of the cosmic perspectives of life, and that there is a much greater evolutionary intelligence, I call the higher evolution, that is ready and willing to make contact with us in the first part of the 21st century. and bring us out of the quagmire of history and the down cycle of being preoccupied with using military technology and what I will call a object-oriented science rather than a human-oriented science to see our way through difficult periods of confrontation.
Are you saying that we have a choice?
We definitely have a choice. We definitely have a free will, and in the tremendous traditions of the Far East, the Near East, and the African heritage, we have seen that our ancestors have not been afraid of the peoples from the stars. They have been, in their folk lore, in their scribal traditions, very affirmative in the fact that the human race must prepare itself for its last great lesson. The ability to leave schoolhouse earth behind and go into the college or the University of the Cosmos, where we will find our classmates or our cosmic cousins. I believe this is the importance of what we're doing at the Academy for Future Science and like-minded futuristic groups throughout the world, preparing people to see that we are not going to simply remain on planet Earth and the umbilical cord with Mother Earth are being broken, that we are going to understand how we demythologize the symbols, that there is a deeper meaning behind the symbols. And as we look at the symbol of Mother Earth, we will see also the counterpart in the concept of the Divine Mother, the mothering aspect of the divine in our life. As we look at the symbol of the prophet tradition of the Holy Land or the prophetic patriarchal tradition of Egypt and Africa, the matriarchal tradition, we're going to see that all of these point to something that will enable the human race to become, as it were, Homo universalis, humanity of the universe, citizens, if you will, of the cosmos.
I think many people would find that quite a frightening thought, cutting the umbilical cord and leaving Mother Earth.
Well, such is the whole challenge of life, is the reality that the mothering side, the incubation period, is something that we are now prepared to leave. We have a universe within us that's beginning to break open and recognize that the star map of evolution is here. And we are walking stars. We recognize, as we look at ourselves through a microscope, that our blood comes out of the ionization of life, which comes out of Mother Earth, which comes out of the sun, which is a star, and so we are basically a walking star. And as we break through the frontiers of, should we say, the limits of language, the fundamentalism of science that doesn't recognize multidimensional possibilities of life in the universe, in the cosmos, and certain restrictions of, what we say, traditions in religion, religious fundamentalism that do not recognize the pluralism and the concepts that we're all one, we're all children of God. There is this unique opportunity to see how the mothering side and the fathering side, what we call the left and right side of the human psyche, the human mind, come together in marriage. What I would call scientific evolution and consciousness evolution, the alpha and the omega of what the prophets and the great thinkers have seen down through the centuries, is something that ultimately happens when we go through the final cycle of history and grow up and say we are no longer a host to linear reality. We're no longer the playthings of the princes of the earth, or the quote-unquote the warlords or the time lords of destruction, but we are working with the fantastic inspiration of the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, what we would call in the prophetic tradition the Shekinah, the Spirit that resides within everyone who chooses the higher path.
Dr. Hurtak, many people have questions around heaven and what one should do to attain heaven or heavenly status. What do you think about that?
Edgar Mitchell, the famous American astronaut who was the sixth man on the moon, once said if you wanted to go into outer space, you could go there two ways. You could get in a rocket ship and lift off, or you could go there with the power of the mind in both realities, one is going to heaven, one is going into the higher world, so to speak, beyond planet Earth. It's a question of not one heaven, but many heavens. And if you look at the Hebrew word in our Bible for heaven, Shammai, means many, many heavens. In fact, the psalmist, King David, speaks of the heaven of the heavens. So clearly for many of the ancients, even in the Oriental tradition, one could go to the highest of worlds, the highest of heavens, through proper spiritual preparation, or through any number of means, even through the use of a vehicle of ascension, not a physical spaceship, but a vehicle of ascension. This was called in Sanskrit the Vimana or the Tathagata, in the Hebrew the Merkabah. Then one would enter into the Father universe or the Master universe or the heaven of the heavens. And that seems to be the thrust of the mystical side of the great traditions of both East and West, found in the Sutra literature and in the Near East literature of what is called the House of Many Mansions, or the Hekaloth, the world of the higher creation.
Would one ever see a physical manifestation of a Merkabah? And if so, what would one see?
And one could imagine oneself inside of a snowflake, energized by tremendous light, greater than that of our sun, called superluminal light. If one could feel oneself on the transport of energy, going through multiple star fields, seeing multiple landscapes, and recognizing omnidirectionality, that one can go wherever one's thoughts think in terms of a divine protective power. And I emphasize the divine connection here because the UFO stories and inventions do not fall into this category. Then one ultimately experiences the Merkabah, which is the divine vehicle, where one feels the presence of either the divine voice, one's spiritual guide, or even the Godhead. One recognizes a type of spiritual insight, a visionary experience, and in some instances, one actually makes contacts with other beings of intelligence. I will call ultra-terrestrial as opposed to extraterrestrial. Extraterrestrial are still human-like physical forms, albeit in a different scientific dimension or planetary field, whereas ultra-terrestrial would come closest to what we would call the angelic, the super-angelic, or in the Sanskrit tradition, that of the avatars, beings of superb mind and spiritual perfection.
Dr. Hurtak, the Middle East always seems to be in such dreadful turmoil. There are always people fighting for that little piece of land. Why is that?
If you look at the movements of thought and religion that are based upon a singularity of a singular covenant of Abraham, rather than understanding Abraham to mean father of nations, father of many people, if you can go with the pluralistic nuance as opposed to the singular nuance, then you can begin to appreciate the fantastic archaeological treasury the Middle East is, that could unite, in essence, the East and the West on the common basis of a higher teaching, a higher focal point. But if you use the Bible as a political textbook and you go with the lower singularities, then you essentially fall victim to the dialectic of culture history. And in the colonial and pre-colonial period, the Middle East was called the Middle East because it was between the eastern and western parts of the British Empire. So even the question itself begs a type of colonial a priori logic. But we want to look at the Middle East as a mecca, as a treasury of knowledge. And to that end, I work with researchers in Yemen who've worked with the findings of the temple tradition of the Queen of Sheba, connecting the story of Solomon and Sheba with Yemen and the Falasha, or the black Jews of Ethiopia. To me, opens up the back door for a rich history of how the incredible remains of lost scriptures, such as the books of Enoch, such as the Pistis Sophia text, as it is called in the ancient Greek Coptic, on the higher wisdom, were sequestered buried in Egypt and also brought down the area of the Sudan into Ethiopia where they were kept. And so that whole area, to me, is a gold mine of exploration if we can have the psychological and the sociological balance that could bring out both the matriarchal tradition of Sheba as well as the patriarchal tradition of the prophets that we find from Egypt influencing all of East Africa.
Well, there's a lot of talk about the Ark residing in Ethiopia. Do you have any thoughts on that?
My colleague Graham Hancock did a special on the Ark, the Aron as it is called, found in Ethiopia, but my feelings are we have a replica Ark in Ethiopia, and that the findings of the original Ark may be still either in the Holy Land or in Egypt, and I feel we're very close to finding this reality. And with this would come a type of prophecy that there would be the appearance of the Messianic age for all of humanity, that with the Ark there would be such great superluminal light, such a great intensity of the divine presence, the finding of the lost text of the Ten Commandments. All of this would usher in really the long-sought Messianic period. And everybody in their own sense of spiritual anticipation would see something beyond argumentation, beyond the political and geopolitical dialectic, that this was something from the higher realms of intelligence that would manifest itself upon the face of the earth, unifying the human race quickly and putting to flight all of the mischief makers, all of the lower misunderstanding connected with traditional religion.
Who are the mischief makers?
In my opinion, the mischief makers are those who see the divine providence of the Most High God and His scriptures to be based upon an ethnic interpretation or a geopolitical interpretation or a singular interpretation to the exclusion of the global humanity. Those from all people who choose to be chosen, or those who choose to see the ongoing nature of God's Holy Spirit being poured forth upon the earth. If you look very carefully at the book of Genesis, the Bereshith as it is called in the original, you will find that the seventh day did not come to an end. The first 6 days come to an end, but the seventh day, the period of the blessing with the angelic family, doesn't come to an end, which suggests that there is this possibility of real connection with the higher evolution, with the cosmic forces of divine intelligence revisiting the earth. Some would call it the myth of the eternal return, the coming back of the programmers or thinkers. And each part of the human race has its own terminology, has its own jargon. But if you go beyond that to much higher levels of interpretation, you will see that it's the whole human creation awakening to a type of star birth, a quantum change from the human reality into that of the new humanity, what the Apostle Paul would call in the New Testament the second Adam, or Adam, the Adamic nature being revitalized. From Alpha to Omega, it is all there. The Bible in stone is the Great Pyramid. And as we go into the interior and find the other rooms and the other subchambers, I believe we will find documents that go with those in the Bible at the time of Jacob and Joseph that will unify the religions, not only in the Middle East, but we will see how the Great Pyramid as a construct also points to similar events in the Far East, in the South, in the Americas of the New World, as a point of unity, a sacred geometry, if you will, of unity of science in the secular world with the supreme geometry of spiritual oneness.